step into the roots of a nation. In this visual journey through 1 Chronicles Chapters 2 and 3, we trace the family lines that shape the story of Israel, from ancient names to royal bloodlines. No narration, no distractions, just sacred history brought to life, frame by frame.
Chronicles 1st chapter 2.
Israel's sons. These were the sons of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Judah. To Hezron's sons. The sons of Judah: Onan, and Shelah. These three were born to him by a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua. Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Judah's daughter-in-law Tamar bore Perez and Zerah to Judah. He had 5 sons in all. The sons of Perez: Hezron and Hamul. The sons of Zerah: Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, 5 in all. The son of Carmi: Ichar, who brought trouble on Israel by violating the ban on taking devoted things. The son of Ethan: Azariah. The sons born to Hezron were Jerahmeel, Ram, and Caleb. From Ram, son of Hezron, Ram was the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, the leader of the people of Judah. Nahshon was the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, and Obed the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of Eliab, his firstborn. The second son was Abinadab, the third Shimea, the fourth Nethanel, the fifth Radai, the sixth Ozem, and the seventh David. Their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail. Zeruiah's 3 sons were Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. Abigail was the mother of Amasa, whose father was Jether the Ishmaelite. Caleb, son of Hezron. Caleb, son of Hezron, had children by his wife Azubah and by Jeriath. These were her sons, Jesher, Shobab, and Arden. When Azubah died, Caleb married Ephrath, who bore him Hur. Hur was the father of Uri, and Uri the father of Bezalel. Later, Hezron, when he was 60 years old, married the daughter of Machir, the father of Gilead. He made love to her, and she bore him Segub. Segub was the father of Jair, who controlled 23 towns in Gilead. But Gesher and Aram captured Havoth Jair, as well as Kenath with its surrounding settlements, 60 towns. All these were descendants of Machir, the father of Gilead. After Hezron died in Caleb Ephrathah, Abijah, the wife of Hezron, bore him Asher, the father of Tekoa. Jerahmeel, son of Hezron. The sons of Jerahmeel, the firstborn of Hezron: Ram his firstborn, Bunah, Oren, Ozem, and Ahijah. Jerahmeel had another wife, whose name was Atara. She was the mother of Onam. The sons of Ram, the firstborn of Jerahmeel: Maz, Jamin, and Eker. The sons of Onam: Shammai and Jada. The sons of Shammai: Nadab and Abishur. Abishur's wife was named Abihail, who bore him Arban and Molid. The sons of Nadab: Seled and Apaim. Seled died without children. The son of Apaim: Ishi, who was the father of Sheshan. Sheshan was the father of Alai. The sons of Jada, Shammai's brother, Jether and Jonathan. Jether died without children. The sons of Jonathan: Peleth and Zaza. These were the descendants of Jerahmeel. Sheshan had no sons, only daughters. He had an Egyptian servant named Jarha. Sheshan gave his daughter in marriage to his servant Jarha, and she bore him Attai. Attai was the father of Nathan, Nathan the father of Zabad, Zabad the father of Ephlal, Ephlal the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jehu, Jehu the father of Azariah, Azariah the father of Helez, Helez the father of Eleasa, Eleasa the father of Sismai, Sismai the father of Shallum, Shallum the father of Jechamiah, and Jechamiah the father of Elishama. The clans of Caleb, the sons of Caleb, the brother of Jerahmeel: Meshar his firstborn, who was the father of Ziph, and his son Maresha, who was the father of Hebron. The sons of Hebron: Korah, Tapua, Rechem, and Shema. Shema was the father of Raham, and Raham the father of Jorkeam. Rechem was the father of Shammai. The son of Shammai was Maon, and Maon was the father of Beth-zur. Caleb's concubine Ephah was the mother of Haran, Mosa, and Gazez. Haran was the father of Gazez. The sons of Jardai: Regem, Jotham, Geshan, Pelet, Apha, and Shaph. Caleb's concubine Maacah was the mother of Sheba and Tirhana. She also gave birth to Shaph, the father of Madmannah, and to Sheva, the father of Machbenah and Gibeah. Caleb's daughter was Achsah. These were the descendants of Caleb. The sons of Hur, the firstborn of Ephrathah, Shobal, the father of Kiriath Jearim, Salma, the father of Bethlehem, and Hareph, the father of Beth-gader. The descendants of Shobal, the father of Kiriath Jearim, were Haroah, half the Manahathites, and the clans of Kiriath Jearim, the Ithrites, Puthites, Shumathites, and Mishrites. From these descended the Zorathites and Eshtaolites. The descendants of Salma, Bethlehem, the Netophathites, Atroth, Beth-Joab, half the Manahathites, the Zorites, and the clans of scribes who lived at Jabez, the Tirathites, Shemeathites, and Sukathites. These are the Kenites who came from Hamath, the father of the Rechabites.
Chronicles 1, chapters 3. The sons of David. These were the sons of David born to him in Hebron. The firstborn was Amnon, the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel. The second, Daniel, the son of Abigail of Carmel. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, by his wife Eglah. These 6 were born to David in Hebron, where he reigned 7 years and 6 months. David reigned in Jerusalem 33 years, 5, and these were the children born to him there: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. These 4 were by Bathsheba, daughter of Amiel. There were also Ibhar, Elishua, Eliphalet, Nogah, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet, 9 in all. All these were the sons of David, besides his sons by his concubines, and Tamar was their sister, the kings of Judah. Solomon's son was Rehoboam, Abijah his son, Asa his son, Jehoshaphat his son, Jehoram his son, Ahaziah his son, Joash his son, Amaziah his son, Azariah his son, Jotham his son, Ahaz his son, Hezekiah his son, Manasseh his son, Amon his son, Josiah his son. The sons of Josiah: Johanan the firstborn, Jehoiakim the second son, Zedekiah the third, Shallum the fourth. The successors of Jehoiakim: Jehoiakim his son, and Zedekiah. The royal line after the exile. The descendants of Jehoiakim the captive: Shealtiel his son, Malchiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechamiah, Hoshama, and Nedabiah. The sons of Pedaiah: Zerubbabel and Shimei. The sons of Zerubbabel: Meshullam and Hananiah. Shelomith was their sister. There were also 5 others: Hashubah, Ohel, Berechiah, Hasadiah, and Jushab-Hesed. The descendants of Hananiah: Pelatiah and Jeshiah, and the sons of Rephaiah, of Arnan, of Obadiah, and of Shechaniah. The descendants of Shechaniah: Shemaiah and his sons, Hattush, Igal, Bariah, Neariah, and Shaphat, 6 in all. The sons of Neariah: Elioenai, Hizkiah, and Azrikam, 3 in all. The sons of Elioenai: Hodaviah, Eliashib, Peliah, Akub, Johanan, Deliah, and Anani, 8 in all. Enjoyed the journey? Help this project grow. Subscribe to stay connected. Like to show your support. Comment to share your thoughts. More chapters await. Follow the path through the playlist below. Thank you for being part of this visual Bible experience.